Mr. Horrocleave from keeping Louis in the office all the morning. She wondered that the idea had not occurred to Louis, who was very gifted in such matters as the arrangement of rendezvous. She started in good time because she wanted to walk without hurry and to ponder. The morning, though imperfect and sunless, had in it some quality of the spring, which the buoyant youth of Rachel instantly discovered and tasted in triumph. Moreover, the spirit of a festival was abroad, and visible in the costume and faces of passers-by, and it was the first festival of the year. Rachel responded to it eagerly, mingling her happiness with the general exultation. She was intensely, unreasonably happy. She knew that she was unreasonably happy, and she did not mind. When she turned into Friendly Street, the big black double gates of the works were shut, but in one of them a little door stood ajar. She pushed it, stooped, and entered the twilight of the archway. The office door was shut. She walked uncertain up the archway into the yard, and through a dirty window on her left she could dimly discern a man gesticulating. She decided that he must be Horrocleave. She hesitated, and then, slightly confused, thought, perhaps I'd better go back to the archway and knock at the office door. III. In the inner office, among art lustre ware, ink-stained wood, dusty papers and dirt, Jim Horrocleave banged down a petty cash book onto Louis's desk. His hat was at the back of his head, and his eyes blazed at Louis, who stood somewhat limply, with a hesitant, foolish, faint smile on his face. "That's enough," said Horrocleave fiercely. "I haven't had patience to go all through it, but that's enough. I needn't tell you I suspected you last year, but you put me off, and I was too busy to take the trouble to go into it. However, I've had a fair chance while you've been away." He gave a sneering laugh. "I'll tell you what put me on to you again, if you've a mind to know. The weekly expenses went down as soon as you thought I had suspicions. You weren't clever enough to keep 'em up. Well, what have you got to say for yourself, seeing you're on your way to America?" "I never meant to go to America," said Louis. "Why should I go to America?" "Ask me another. Then you confess?" "I don't," said Louis. "Oh, you don't?" Horrocleave sat down and put his hands on his outstretched knees. "There may be mistakes in the petty cash book. I don't say there aren't. Any one who keeps a petty cash book stands to lose. If he's too busy at the moment to enter up a payment, he may forget it, and there you are. He's out of pocket. Of course," Louis added, with a certain loftiness, "as you're making a fuss about it, I'll pay up for anything that's wrong. Whatever the sum is, if you make it out to be £100, I'll pay up." Horrocleave growled. "Oh, so you'll pay up, will you? And I suppose I won't let you pay up? What shall you do then?" Louis, now quite convinced that Horrocleave was only bullying, retorted calmly, "It's I that ought to ask you that question." The accuser was exasperated. "A couple of years in quad will be about your mark, I'm thinking," he said. Whereupon Louis was suddenly inspired to answer, "Yes, and supposing I was to begin to talk about illicit commissions?" Horrocleave jumped up with such ferocious violence that Louis drew back, startled. The recent Act of Parliament making a crime of secret commissions to customers' employees had been a blow to the trade in art lustre ware, and it was no secret in the inner office that Horrocleave, resenting its interference with the natural course of business, had more than once discreetly flouted it, and thus technically transgressed the criminal law. Horrocleave used to defend and justify himself by the use of that word, technical. Louis's polite and unpremeditated threat enraged him to an extreme degree. He was the savage infuriate. He cared for no consequences, even consequences to himself. He hated Louis because Louis was spick and span and quiet, and because Louis had been palmed off on him by Louis's unscrupulous, respectable relatives as an honest man. "Now thou'st done for thyself," he cried in the dialect. "Thou'st done for thyself, and I'll have thee by the heels for embezzlement and blackmail as well." He waved his arms. "May God strike me if I give thee any quarter after that. I'll—" He stopped with open mouth, disturbed by the perception of a highly strange phenomenon beyond the window. He looked and saw Rachel in the yard. For a moment he thought that Louis had planned to use his wife as a shield in the affair if the worst should come to the worst, but Rachel's appearance simultaneously showed him that he was wrong. She was the very mirror of happy confidence, and she seemed so young and so obviously just married, and so girlish and so womanish at the same time, and her frock was so fresh and her hat so pert against the heavy disorder of the yard, and her eyes were unconsciously so wistful, that Horrocleave caught his breath. He contrasted Rachel with Mrs. Horrocleave, her complete antithesis, and at once felt very sorry for himself and very scornful of Mrs. Horrocleave, and melting with worshipful sympathy for Rachel. "Your wife's in the yard," he whispered in a different tone. "My wife?" Louis was gravely alarmed, all his manner altered. "Hast told her anything of this?" "I should think I hadn't." "You must pay me, and I'll give you notice to leave," said Horrocleave quickly, in a queer, quiet voice. The wrath was driven out of him. The mere apparition of Rachel had saved her husband. A silence. Rachel had disappeared. Then there was a distant tapping. Neither of the men spoke nor moved. They could hear the outer door open and light footfalls in the outer office. "Anybody here?" It was Rachel's voice, timid. Come in," Horrocleave roared. She entered, blushing, excusing herself, glancing from one to the other, and by her spotless Easter finery emphasizing the squalor of the den. In a few minutes Horrocleave was saying to Rachel rather apologetically, Louis and I are going to part company, Mrs. Forrest. I can't keep him on. His wages are too high for me. It won't run to it. The truth is, I'm going to chuck this art business. It doesn't pay. Art, as they call it's no good in the pottery trade." Rachel said, "So that's what you wanted to see him about on a Sunday morning, is it, Mr. Horrocleave?" She was a little hurt at the slight on her husband, but the wife in her was persuaded that the loss would be Mr. Horrocleave's. She foresaw that Louis would now want to use his capital in some commercial undertaking of his own, and she was afraid of the prospect. Still, it had to be faced, and she would face it. He would probably do well as his own master. During a horrible week her judgment on him had been unjustly severe, and she did not mean to fall into the same sin again. She thought with respect of his artistic gifts, which she was too inartistic to appreciate. Yes, the chances were that he would succeed admirably. She walked him off to church, giving Horrocleave a perfunctory good-bye, and as, shoulder to shoulder, they descended towards St. Luke's, she looked sideways at Louis and fed her passion stealthily with the sight. True, even in those moments she had heart enough left to think of others besides. She hoped that John's Ernest would find a suitable mate. She remembered that she had Julian's curtains to attend to. She continued to think kindly of Thomas Batchgrew, and she chid herself for having thought of him in her distant, inexperienced youth of 6 months earlier as "that man," and regretting that Mrs. Tams, at her age too, could be so foolish. She determined to look after Mrs. Tams also, if need should arise. But these solicitudes were mere downy trifles floating on the surface of her profound absorption in Louis, and in the depths of that absorption she felt secure, and her courage laughed at the menace of life, though the notion of braving a church full of people did intimidate the bride. Yet she judged Louis realistically and not sentimentally. She was not conspicuously blind to any aspect of his character, nor had the tremendous revulsion of the previous night transformed him into another and a more heavenly being for her. She admitted frankly to herself that he was not blameless in the dark affair of the bank-notes. She would not deny that in some ways he was untrustworthy, and might be capable of acts of which the consequences were usually terrible. His irresponsibility was notorious, and being impulsive herself, she had no mercy for his impulsiveness. As for his common sense, was not her burning of the circular addressed to Mrs. Maldon a sufficient commentary on it? She was well aware that Louis's sins of omission and commission might violently shock people of a certain temperament, people of her own temperament in particular. These people, however, would fail to see the other side of Louis. If she herself had merely heard of Louis instead of knowing him, she would probably have set him down as undesirable. But she knew him. His good qualities seemed to her to overwhelm the others: his charm, his elegance, his affectionateness, his nice speech, his courtesy, his quick wit, his worldliness. She really considered it extraordinary that a plain, blunt girl such as she should have had the luck to please him. It was indeed almost miraculous. If he had faults, and he had, she preferred them, proudly and passionately, to the faults of scores of other women's husbands. He was not a brute, nor even a boor, nor a savage. Thousands of savages ranged free and terror-striking in the Five Towns. Even when vexed and furious he could control himself. It was possible to share his daily life and see him in all his social moods without being humiliated. He was not a clodhopper. Watch him from the bow window of a morning as he walked down the street. He did not drink. He was not a beast. He was not mean. He might scatter money, but he was not mean. In fact, except that one sinister streak in his nature, she could detect no fault. There was danger in that streak. Well, there was danger in every man. She would accept it. She would watch it. Had she not long since reconciled herself to the prospect of an everlasting vigil? She did not care what anyone said, and she did not care. He was the man she wanted. The whole rest of the world was nothing in comparison to him. He was irresistible. She had wanted him, and she would always want him as he was. She had won him, and she would keep him as he was, whatever the future might hold. The past was the past. The opening chapter of her marriage was definitely finished, and its drama done. She was ready for the future. One tragedy alone could overthrow her: Louis's death. She simply could not and would not conceive existence without him. She would face anything but that. Besides, he was not really untrustworthy, only weak. She faltered and recovered. He's mine, and I wouldn't have him altered for the world. I don't want him perfect. If anything goes wrong, well, let it go wrong. I'm his wife. I'm his. And as, slightly raising her confident chin in the street, she thus undertook to pay the price of love, there was something divine about Rachel's face. End of chapter 19, and End of The Price of Love by Arnold Bennett.